G'day, welcome back. In today's episode, nothing spells social cohesion quite like the ABC funding a 25-minute rant that is full of racism, fake statistics, and absolute vitriol towards 76% of the Australian population. The coalition is officially kaput, and Donald Trump takes aim at NATO. But in the meantime, he offends every single ally that's ever worked with America in its history. We'll get into all of that on the Mark Pirotta Show.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Blaster! Welcome to the Mark Pirotta Show.
Before we take aim at Tony Armstrong for what can only be described as a steaming pile of crap that was hosted by the ABC, let's watch this clip. A bit of a promo for a guy who doesn't need a promo, Carl Stefanovic, who is starting right at the top, introducing his very first special guest on his new show, The Carl Stefanovic Show. Watch. Very excited for this one to pop off. Now, Carl Stefanovic could be the latest in a long list of ex-news presenters unshackled by the legalities of the corporate world and corporate media. Could he end up in the same tranche as Candace Owens, as Don Lemon, and as Tucker Carlson, where unleashing them with no constraints means that we actually get a worse version than we had before? Or could he do this properly? I have high hopes for him. Carl Stefanovic's always been a pretty decent bloke, good guy. He's basically been the face of news and the most popular guy in news for the better part of 20, 30 years. So good luck to Carl. I hope he takes over the space. And first guest is Pauline Hanson. You can't go much higher than that. Unfortunately, making these sorts of little please-dos is kind of essential. I enjoy doing it just for the fun of it, but at the same time, if you want to get a message out, you need the people in your community to just comment, like, subscribe, all of the normal jargon, right? Please just take a moment and give me a hand. We need to create a culture of commentary together. And I love the messages coming in my DMs. Put it in the comments section so that everyone else can see it too. Thank you. Coalition is officially kaput. It's done. It's buried. Both leaders and both parties have effectively said that they will not work with the other. David Littleproud started the skirmish, technically. Susan Ley accepted the resignation of the 3 National senators who voted against the bill. Now, in a normal world, the way this works is that the senators would tend their resignation, and upon tending their resignation, the leader of the opposition should, in effect, say no. Susan Ley should have taken the high road here and said that they had their right to actually make their own decision in order to ensure that their party and the people that they represent were properly represented in the government. But instead, she accepted those resignations, and within a formal letter that was later announced by David Littleproud, he had stated that if she accepted those resignations, then every sitting member of the Nationals in the lower house would also resign. That happened, and this is the fallout. Watch.
Point being, if the National Party has a position that they cannot support the legislation, the Liberals change their mind, and with their numbers on shadow cabinet, of course, that will be the majority decision. It's always then got to be ratified by either the party room sitting separately or, as is normally the case, the joint party room. If you're confirming that the first time in 11 years for you that there was no joint party room meeting, the National Party senators can only follow the conscience of their party room where the opposition to the bill is there, right? So I can't see how they broke any convention. I think if they had not done what they had done, they would have been just as much a pilloried figure inside their own party as they are now with Susan Ley. Surely her position, given the comments of your leader, is no longer tenable. Does she have to be removed before there's any chance of the coalition reforming?
Look, the leadership of the Liberal Party is a matter for the Liberal Party, but there are some consequences of the decisions that Susan Ley has made here to sack these ministers. It was just simply inevitable after doing that there was no longer going to be membership of the
Okay, Matt,
Nationalist
I'll
Party
ask
and
you
shadow
another one.
ministry.
I'll ask you another one then.
Yeah.
Okay, I know you'll give me the line about not commenting on Liberal leadership, which you just did. But in terms of just quickly, the substantive legislation, when you were briefed on the legislation by, I presume, various shadow ministers, how confident were you, given you had read every page of that legislation, how confident were you that they were across the implications, the changes that Labor were making to the legislation almost hour by hour?
Look, there were unanswered questions, Peter. There were very simple questions put that just couldn't be answered. For example, in particular, there's a provision of this bill which says that the serious harm could amount to economic harm in the definition of hate crime. So you could be accused of a hate crime if you do something which just harms people economically. So I asked, well, what happens if you organise an economic boycott of a country's products, say Russia's products for invading Ukraine? And there was no answer about, is that a hate crime? It seemingly meets the definition because you're doing so on a national basis. I mean, I participated in a boycott of Woolworths a few years ago. I was very proud to do so. And I think every Australian has a right to decide what products they buy. And it just seemed ridiculous to me that we would have legislation that would potentially capture that kind of political response, which is perfectly legitimate.
So Matt Canavan, in so many words, said what needed to be said, is that there are consequences for the actions that have been taken. And the consequences are simply this, and it's taken me some time to wrap my head around what should have happened. The Liberals should definitely have voted against this legislation. They should never have made a deal with the Labor Party, because in doing so, they've given Labor the ability to call this a bipartisan bill. And what that means in effect is that the Liberals can't use this at the next election. Who can use it is Pauline Hanson. She's already doing it to great effect. The next poll has not come out yet, but I can't see it being anything less than a bombshell for the One Nation party. One Nation is going to take upwards of 32% in this next poll. That's my estimation. It seems untenable at this stage that the Nationals and Liberals will ever come together again. And it seems the motif for today's episode, that social cohesion, party cohesion, and cohesion of our nation is simply at stake. Now let's get into Tony Armstrong and his 25 minutes of two-faced, too wrong, and always was going to be a terrible heap of crap. Let's watch.
And now, for the very first time on the ABC, it's Always Was Tonight with your host, Tony Armstrong.
Hey, I'm Tony Armstrong. This is Always Was Tonight. It's an honour to be the first blackface fronting a comedy show on the ABC since Chris Lilly. Tonight, we're giving the colony a colonoscopy. This show is black, it's cracked, and it wants its lamb back. Plus, we all know Aboriginal people make the best ABC content. There's Mystery Road Origin, and just announced, Mystery Road Gentrified. Now the road has a Yochi. Of course, tonight isn't all fun. We'll also tell you some disturbing facts about January 26th. Like, did you know that January 26th is also the birthday of Ellen DeGeneres?
So things started off pretty strong. You know, a little bit of the normal race baiting, a normal amount of the Aboriginal language, the colony, straight into January 26th. A little bit of, you know, self-attack, if you know what I mean, calling it it's black, it's cracked, and then saying it wants its land back. Things started off okay. The next 23 minutes is just a diabolical pile of lies, half-truths, and a whole lot of missing information. This 25 minutes sums up what is in effect the Aboriginal position on Australia Day. The Aboriginal position on where Australia sits in relation to Indigenous peoples, but specifically those Indigenous peoples who see themselves as sovereign against the Australian nation. Now, obviously, not all Indigenous people think this way. I don't even believe that it's an actual majority. When you look at the way that Indigenous voices voted during the Voice campaign, it was something like a 60-40 split. And I mean, if you don't know what's inside of a piece of legislation, then chances are you're going to vote no. But there's also the chance that you'll actually vote yes because you just think that if it's something good for me and my people, then we'll probably vote for it. The way that Indigenous people vote inside of Australia is very intriguing. Not only do they have one of the lowest participation rates because they do not have compulsory voting in Australia within the Indigenous communities. The other interesting fact that does exist is this. There are pockets of Australia that are technically today, under the modern legal theory of sovereignty, sovereign. That is to say that they exist as nations within this nation. It's a little known fact, not many people know about it. Now we hear about traditional ownership, land rights, custodial land, but there are actual nations built into the fabric of what Australia is, into our landmass. We are not one unified country. There are people who have actually corporatized local areas and turned it into sovereign plains, where they are technically under the jurisdiction of Australia, but can, in their own effect, get Indigenous passports, which are actually useful in some nations, can be accepted by some nations. But let's dig into the rest of this episode. I watched it. It's only 25 minutes, so you have to watch it too.
Yep. Just when you thought it couldn't get any more controversial. No wonder she was cancelled. It's not a day to celebrate, Ellen. But first, across this nation, the welcome to country has been attacked by racists, degraded by politicians, and used as fuel for the culture wars. But I actually understand the importance and beauty of acknowledging the land that I'm on, which is why I have organised a very special welcome to country from one of the nation's most beloved aunties. Come in, Auntie Donna.
Oh, Tony, mate, I think there's been a horrible mistake.
So I think you've maybe called the wrong Auntie Donna. Our comedy group is called Auntie Donna, but none of us are aunties or Aboriginal. I mean, Mark is Italian, but that's not his fault.
It would not be culturally appropriate, I don't think.
In this climate, it would be career suicide.
Gadigal.
Oh, all right. Well, thanks, Tony. We'll go back to you now. Can you just cut that, please, and just can I get that footage?
That was the funniest part of the whole show. And Tony didn't even deliver it. The funniest part of the whole show was a bunch of random blokes who run a comedy group called Auntie Donna, which is, after I looked them up, actually properly hilarious. It's just coincidental that the guy's name is Mark that comes in there and screams Gadigal, Gadigal, Gadigal. I am also on Gadigal land myself, actually. But what's interesting about this is that the last and only funny portion of this entire episode was actually done by Australians who will probably celebrate Australia Day. In any case, let's keep watching.
Coming to you tonight from the lands of the Gadigal people from the ABC studios, this is Always Was Tonight. Now, everyone knows the fastest way for a fella with melanin to get on the television is to cook something. So tonight, I'm sharing one of my most patriotic recipes. So if you're planning on having a barbecue this January 26th, you can swallow me.
What does that even mean? What? Let's keep going.
It's all part of my new segment, Captain Cooks.
Super original. People have been making that joke effectively since Captain Cook was cooked. By Indigenous populations. Not on Australia, but on one of the islands where he effectively tried to take the crown prince or the tribal leader and then was taken, killed, and, from what we know, cooked. Let's keep watching.
Some people say you shouldn't get too political around January 26. It might ruin the barbecue. Well, I'd never want to ruin a barbecue, so here's some tips to get yours sizzling. The secret is seasoning. This spice mix has a hint of lemon myrtle in it. Flip the meat so that it's coated on both sides. just as some historians believe the gifts distributed by soldiers given to Aboriginal people at Manly Cove were coated in smallpox. But don't focus on that. It might ruin the barbecue. I'm using olive oil, but you can use whatever oil you prefer, as long as the bottle doesn't remind you of the vial of live smallpox variola matter reportedly in the possession of Dr. John White, surgeon with the First Fleet. Because that could ruin the barbecue. Time to whack your steaks onto the hot plate, which you want super hot, feverishly hot. Let's get a couple on now. It's hot. Searing the meat helps with the flavour, but it also caramelizes your seasoning as the surface blisters. Speaking of blisters and fevers, don't think about the reports that within a year or so, half of the Aboriginal people in the Sydney area were dead, killed by smallpox. That could ruin the barbecue. After a couple of minutes, it's time to turn your...
We're just going to stop there. We'll get into the content. But that is a terribly, terribly seared steak. Surely they could have spent another 5 minutes and actually caramelized that thing. That is an affront. That is... If that's what bush tucker is, good Lord.
Meat. It's really important to keep an eye on the time, so you don't overcook your meat and ruin the barbecue. Time was, of course, something the Aboriginal people didn't have. Within the first couple of years, reports suggest roughly half to 70% of the Indigenous population of the southeast were gone. Imagine if 70% of the guests at your barbecue were gone, forever, within just a few years.
That's an interesting statement, that the Indigenous people didn't have time. From what we know, they had 65,000 to 80,000 years of incredible peace in this nation. There was no war between the nations, the peoples that lived here. There was only peace and prosperity and living among the land. In fact, they had nothing but time. And so you'd think that if the conflict of different ideas that existed within Europe was such a terrible thing, that the ideas that made it to these shores were such a terrible thing, that the Indigenous people who had been living in relative, and by relative I mean unfathomable, unmatched, unseen anywhere else on earth peace, as is explained to us as white Australians, in pretty much every social circle today, on every government program, and in every institution, then they would have been leaps and bounds. It would have been Atlantis by the time that the British colony ships arrived in Australia. Let's keep going.
Actually, don't think about that. It'll ruin the barbecue. Well, these are looking great. Time to get them off the heat and let them rest for a couple of minutes. By the way, did you know that no member of the First Fleet was recorded as having been infected by smallpox? Makes you wonder, how did the locals get infected by it in the first place? Unless, as some experts have argued, it was deliberately introduced to decimate a population who colonists have described as primitive and barbaric, which would have been a deliberate use of biological warfare, leading to a genocide. But don't let that ruin your barbecue. Bon appetit.
So, one of the most interesting things that you can do if you want to understand what the next angle is going to be by the Indigenous populations of Australia is to see what angle the Indigenous populations of Canada and North America are taking about 2 or 3 years before. If you follow that, you can pretty much see exactly what the next angle of attack is going to be on the colony of Australia. Almost every line item that is used, down to the phrasing of First Nations people, is language and information that is taken from the American colonies. That is to say that the Native Americans do it first, and then the Indigenous Australians do it later. It's all the same funding, the same circles, the same UN bodies that creates all of this language, that creates all of these ideas. And so about 2 to 3 years before we started hearing about this vial of smallpox, we also started hearing about a story with zero evidence, that has zero reports, that has no information wrapped around it, indicating that there could have been intentional biological warfare waged against Indigenous populations in America. And so, logically, we got that same information passed down here to Australia. This isn't theory. You can look this up. Look up the dates of when you started hearing about certain hot button topics that you hear about when it comes to Indigenous Australians, specifically around the language used, even down to the voice. Every single line item can be seen 2 or 3 years previously in America. Now, this vial of smallpox, if we just look at the science of it, it's effectively impossible. In order to be able to bring a vial of smallpox from England all the way to Australia, the First Fleet, who one, had almost no knowledge about germs and germ theory, would have had to bottle up in perfect form a vial of smallpox, bring it from England down through the equator, past the South Cape of South Africa, back up through the equator once again until they arrived all the way back around through humid, hot, and terrible conditions. The chances of a vial of smallpox surviving that journey in and of itself is less than 0.01%, just on its own. Now, 2, you would have to assume that the British had some sort of understanding of germ theory and the way that germs work. Have you ever heard of the song Ringa Ringa Rosie, a pocket full of posy, a tissue, we all fall down? That song was created as a nursery rhyme because people used to believe that putting a pocket full of posy inside of your pockets would heal you or protect you from what was then the bubonic plague. We are not speaking about people who had advanced to the level of understanding how to engage in biological warfare. So 1, it's almost impossible that a vial of smallpox could have made it to Australia. 2, it's almost impossible that they had any understanding of germ theory. And 3, the idea that they could put it onto blankets and spread it in that fashion is also almost impossible. The way that smallpox would spread in that situation was through contact or through respiratory intake. That is to say, breathing it in. Now, there was not a lot of contact between the Australians and the Indigenous populations of Australia in the first 2 years. There was a lot of shouting, a lot of yelling, a lot of spear brandishing, a lot of theft, a lot of killing. But that killing, as a general rule of thumb, did not kick off with the British. Actually, if you look at the statistics, in the first 20 to 30 years, as a percentage of populations, the Indigenous population of Australia, the Aboriginal people, killed at a percentage a higher rate of Australian convicts than the British killed of Aboriginals. Yes, it's terrible that between 70 and 80% of all Aboriginal life ceased to exist within the first 30 years due to disease. But the fact of the matter is, that was not an intended consequence. That was a consequence of the fact that the Indigenous population of Australia had been isolated away from any contact with almost any other nation on Earth until that point in time. I'm sure you can remember back to COVID, that 2 years where the borders were closed. Do you remember that first time that you got sick after COVID and it felt like you were going to die? After that 2 years had passed, people started flying again, going overseas. I distinctly remember my cousin. He went to England probably 3-4 months after the borders had opened back up. And when he came back, he brought back this influenza A. And I'd been sick before, I'd had influenza before, but I copped it. I thought I was going to die. I had never been that sick in my life. And then reports came out that the strains that had allowed themselves to germinate within isolated populations once again had taken 2, 3, or 4 different leaps in different directions than the other countries on Earth. And so obviously, when you were getting a strain that you hadn't had that previous small little bit of immunity built up and built up and built up, people were getting more sick as a consequence. Now imagine that, but spread over 65 to 80,000 years. If you want to know what would kill an Indigenous population quickly, it is disease. When you look at the actual numbers of how many Indigenous people were killed by the British, the numbers are actually very, very small. And not only that, imagine calling that a genocide and then within the course of 200 years, your population reaching its largest ever number. Not only in record speed compared to what you'd achieved between 65,000 and 80,000 years of existence in relative peace and prosperity on this land where you understood exactly the way of life, but not only that, you now have almost twice as many Indigenous people inside of Australia than have ever existed on this continent before. It's a really interesting thing to look up and to see that detail. And sure, there are some who aren't purely Indigenous. There are some who are a quarter, half, 75% gentrified, as Tony Armstrong puts it. But from the very beginning, you'd think that if Tony cooks, then he'd have more to say than just this fake, unsubstantiated, almost impossible scenario that the British population of Australia somehow created a genocide of Indigenous populations intentionally. Technically, it was a genocide, but it was like a germ genocide where the British population had no idea what was coming. But let's keep watching.
Here it always was tonight. We're not just looking at the present, we're also looking to the future. When news emerges, we emerge with it. We exist in the everywhen. What does that mean? I don't know. Which is why I hired someone smarter than me to present this next segment. Give it up for Brooke Blurton!
This is past, present and emerging news. I'm Brooke Blurton, Australia's second favourite Aboriginal newsreader whose first name is Brooke. Here are the headlines that will be emerging later this year. Gina Rinehart will once again call for workers to celebrate Australia Day, pointing to her own mining success. And I, for one, promise to always think of Gina as the owner of Australia's biggest hole. IKEA will issue a product recall on its black slag side table, claiming it means something else in Swedish. Sky News will announce a competitor to Triple J called Triple K. They will celebrate Australia Day by...
That was actually a good one. I take it back. That was a good one. See, that's proper satire. That's a bit of fun.
taking the hood to the hood with the hottest 100 crosses. The AFP will warn that if any more white men leave Melbourne to join Nazi groups in the Grampians, there'll be no one left for Melbourne women to ask, is it in yet, babe? Barnaby Joyce will take over One Nation. Barnaby is famous for public drunkenness, having multiple baby mamas and constantly complaining about the government, to which One Nation said, sure this guy isn't black? A DNA test will confirm Bob Catter is Aboriginal. Asked to comment on the results, Mr. Catter told our journalists, I'm boomerang people in the mouth for yawning like that, cuz. On to sports news. The hottest show on the planet right now is gay ice hockey drama Heated Rivalry. So next year, Channel 7 will announce their own gay romance based on the AFL. Holding the ball. And like the real AFL, Tony Armstrong will have a short cameo where he gets it behind. Anthony Albanese will be finally convinced to fund Aboriginal health outcomes when he realises it will make the South Sydney Rabbitohs less shit. And before we know it, it'll be January again and we'll realise that no one has done anything to actually change the date or fix the problems, so we're going to have to do this show all over again. See you next year.
Well, this is sure fixing the problems. Not only do Indigenous populations receive funding to the tune of $40,000 more than the average Australian person, not only do Indigenous health outcomes receive more funding than the average Australian receives funding, but also they're claiming that somehow this 25-minute segment is meant to cure the division that exists within this country while being simultaneously as divisive as humanly possible and doing it while unfunny. It seems to me at this point that all they're trying to do is smack down white people for existing. Not for actually doing anything, just for being here. People who, by the way, there's currently only about 30% of the Australian population that has any relation to anyone who came here prior to Federation. So you're sort of smacking down on 30% of the Australian population for what purpose? If it was funny, maybe we wouldn't care as much. If we didn't pay for it, maybe we wouldn't care as much. If you want to know what it is to fund Indigenous things, Indigenous programs and Indigenous health outcomes, Indigenous anything, it looks like this. It looks like a program that was put together with likely over $1 million worth of funding for a 25-minute skit where chances are very few people are ever going to get anything out of it, barely a laugh, definitely not a belly laugh. And that money is wasted on some fluffed up project that effectively achieves nothing except increasing the division in this nation. Catchy talking points with no backing, no statistics, no data. In fact, straight up lies, or pointing the finger in the wrong direction. But let's keep going. There's plenty more.
Looking to make a of yourself this January 26th? Not invited to any barbecues, so you're headed to a counter-protest instead. White 10 has everything a white supremacist needs to look their best. Matching black cap and mask set, because you're too much of a pussy to show your face. $9.99. Do-it-yourself right-angled insignia kit. Let's face it, you're too dumb to draw. $9. Heavy-duty bin bags to pack all your shit in when your mum finally kicks you out of the house. You're 36, mate. Come on, move out. $8.88. On your way out, treat yourself to a sausage sizzle. White bread only. Tomato sauce is too spicy. White 10. All welcome, whether they like it or not.
Coming up on the...
It is interesting that you're not allowed to paint with a broad brush anyone from the Indigenous community. But you're allowed to paint with a broad brush anyone from the white community. The people who are organising these marches put their faces on their posters. The people who are organising these marches are known. They don't wear black masks. They don't do Heil Hitler signs. They don't call for the genocide of an entire population in the same way that people who are allied with the Indigenous community, the pro-Palestine group, do call for. The coping in this section was ridiculous. The people who wear black masks and hoodies, as a general rule of thumb, are on the left wing of politics. We know it. It's Antifa and their ilk here in Australia. When we talk about reverse racism, I understand the sentiment. It's not reverse racism, it's just racism. But when we talk about reverse ideology, that is to say that you are entirely projecting your own nonsense onto us. Now, I've never been to one of the marches. I don't intend on going to them because when they do tend to happen, which I'll take that back. I'll probably go to one if it's not on a big event, but I won't be going to an Australia Day march because, much like they said, I'm hosting my own barbecue. But the people who are going to that, I've spoken to quite a few of them. They're good people. And all they want for this country is to not feel as though they're shut out of a housing market, as though they are not priced out of being able to buy groceries, being able to live in this country safely, and that they are sick and tired of being placed second, and of being told that they are problematic simply for their skin tone. If you want to know what projection is, it's pretending as though this program, funded by us the taxpayer, was somehow going to solve racism while being extremely racist. Claiming that every person at one of these rallies on the 26th of January is an NSN member. From what I've seen so far, this entire program has effectively opened up the Indigenous community to more hate and more vitriol. If you think that you can come out on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a taxpayer-funded live streaming service, and think that you are not going to get blowback for putting out something that is one, not funny, and two, factually inaccurate, you've got another thing coming. And I'll be honest, for anyone who wants to come out and call it racist and say that the blowback is racist, I think you ought to take a long, hard look at yourselves. because every single portion of this is not only inaccurate and false, but it is a projection onto your own communities, to the people that you ally yourselves with, and to the people who, despite throwing everything into being like you, still get thrown under the bus as soon as you have the reason to. Watch this next segment. It isn't just racist, it's vile. And I find it seriously problematic for any single white woman who decides that what she wants to do with her day is go and fight for Indigenous populations. Because this is what you sound like. And they're making fun of you in a way that you should not tolerate.
Expert to talk about Aboriginal issues, which is why my next guest is Professor Alison Batcher. Thank you for being here, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And sorry, I'm not sure who you are.
Oh, hi. I'm just a huge fan.
Of what?
Aboriginals. Aboriginality. I'm an emerging ally, so I'm just here to listen and amplify. Racism is gross. Close the gap. Woo!
Okay, sure, Professor. You've said that the work of decolonisation has to begin with truth-telling. What exactly do you mean by that?
Oh my God, yes, that's so right. Like, how are we going to fix the problem if we won't even listen? Like, come on, that's basic stuff.
Yes, thank you. Professor, the government has withdrawn the over $20 million originally promised for the Pirotta Commission. What does that mean for the prospect of the treaty?
God, yes. Tell him about this one. No, it's insane, Tony. The money was reallocated after the failure of the voice referendum, which, oh my God, devastated me. No, seriously, voting no was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do.
Well,
like,
yes,
listening is so important. Can we just be clear on that?
We sure can.
Treaty. Yeah. Treaty now. Come on, treaty. Treaty. Give me a treaty.
That's beautiful.
Thank you, Tony.
Professor.
Well, that continued for another 4 or 5 minutes. Let's get on to this next segment. And then we're going to close out, because otherwise this episode's going to be about an hour and a half long. Watch this as Tony Armstrong discusses with the Rainbow Serpent all things hypocrisy.
The National Mental Health Commission has found that the number of people experiencing financial stress has almost doubled since 2020. So, with living so difficult, we thought we'd bring in the person responsible, the creator of all life and existence, longtime legend, and my dear friend, the Rainbow Serpent!
Thanks for having me, Tony Armstrong.
Thank you for being here. You might be the most famous person we've ever had on the show.
I'm actually a serpent, Tony.
And where are you from again?
Oh, some up there, over there. Some up there, over there. All I can say is, it's a secret. I don't hiss and tell.
Am I detecting a bit of a lisp?
What lisp? I'm the creator of all existence. This is how society's supposed to sound.
That's, of course, my mistake. How has the cost of living affected you, Rainbow?
Oh, don't get me started, Tony. It's been expensive for everyone, even serpents. I've had to access my superannuation early for some new fangs.
What happened?
Oh, too much sugar, Tony. Too much sugar in my sodas. The serpent surgeon says that I need to see a specialist. And soon.
Rainbow? Statistics are showing that the median gross household weekly income for Aboriginal families is still over $300 less than income for non-Indigenous households. How can mob make their money go further?
Oh, stuck me, Tony. We've all got our own ways of scraping by. I've been trying to consume less.
How is that, Rainbow?
Oh, well, I started a sourdough starter in COVID. That helped.
I don't know how to say this in a nice way. I think consuming less might be a good option. I mean, I'm not sure if you've ever seen that video online, but it's one of those American programs where someone is about 800 pounds and they go, I'm starving, I need to eat. And the doctor goes, you don't need to eat. You ate all of your food for the next 4 years. Now, I said that this section was full of hypocrisy, but let's dig into that a little bit. Now, for one, engaging in whiteface, just saying, if we're doing projection here, engaging in whiteface, which is abhorrent to do the opposite way around, but it's okay here. And two, we're speaking to someone about the cost of living crisis and having to cut down on unnecessary things, while speaking to someone who is clearly morbidly obese. There isn't really a nice way to say that. I'm not really understanding the concept of this, whether it was meant to be there as a joke somehow. I found it funny that someone would sit there and cry that the median household income for Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, that there's a $300 disparity, and that somehow the cost of living has something higher to play with that on the Indigenous front. What are you going for here? As we mentioned earlier, Indigenous households receive approximately $40,000 more, or at least they would if Indigenous corporations didn't keep funneling money into their own pockets. There's about 17 Indigenous corporations which receive upwards of $40 billion in funding every year. That money is meant to be proliferated out to every Indigenous person in Australia through economic means and through the waterfall system. But these Indigenous corporations seem to be funneling this money into something very, very different, because most of the Indigenous communities and the people that I speak to all say the same thing, that they never see a dime of this. Now, a $300 disparity is not a lot, if you actually think about it. It's the same thing with the wage gap. When people choose to work less, they are going to earn less. Just because there is a difference doesn't mean there is an inequality. It is not legal in this country to pay an Indigenous person less simply for being Indigenous, as much as it is not possible to pay a woman less for working for the same job in the same amount of time in this country. The fact of the matter is, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. You cannot tell us that you do not want to be part of Australian society and simultaneously cry about the fact that Australian society is not paying you simply for existing. You cannot not want to work and simultaneously complain that the average household income for non-Indigenous people is higher. At the end of the day, that is your prerogative. You cannot introduce a data set and just say that there's $300 difference between the two groups of people, and then say that that is somehow evidence of inequality. Because the fact is, and this is your right to do, if you want to live from the land on the land in the same way that the Indigenous peoples did for 65,000 to 80,000 years, then that is your right. But you're not going to be earning an income. And so even if 20% of the Indigenous population does this, which, by what we know and what we hear, it should be approximately 90% of people who want this who are of Indigenous background. If that is the way that you want to live your life and you choose to do it that way, that data set is going to be corrupted as a consequence. Because those people included in the total count of Indigenous people in Australia earn zero income. In fact, by popular metrics, it is far more likely that you actually earn more for the same job as an Indigenous person in this country, that you have more chance of getting a job as an Indigenous person in this country, because there are Indigenous-specific programs in order to allow you to get into university and into jobs faster. The ABC itself has its own program specifically for hiring and maintaining Indigenous people inside of their corporation. And so this entire segment, and it does continue for a very long time, and they basically say everything. And right at the end, she says sovereignty was never ceded. And she's correct, but sovereignty also never existed, because the definition of sovereignty is very, very specific. The definition of sovereignty effectively means that a group of people have their own law in a set place for an extended period of time, have the ability to defend that sovereignty both within and without that nation, and they do not have that, and they have never had that. Now, the Uluru Statement to the Heart claimed that Indigenous peoples were sovereign. The definition of sovereign was defined within the document, and it basically created a separate definition of sovereignty that is used in legal cases today that does not meet the definition of sovereignty for every other nation on earth. But being placed inside of that language gives them legal precedence in order to actually beat the British court system at its own game, which is that by strict definition, just to say the word sovereignty, though defined separately within their own documents, they technically have legal right to the land as a consequence after the Mabo document. The Mabo case effectively said that Australia was not terra nullius, which to an extent I can see the claim, but at the same time, we're speaking about a legal term which by definition was met. There was no set people here. The Indigenous people that we act as though they are a collective today were never a collective. They had conflicts between each other. Look at the Uruk document. There is very, very clear evidence. Many of the skeletons that we find of Indigenous people today show evidence of war-like trauma. That is to say that there was definitely conflict between nations. The chances are, and this is going to be a controversial statement, at the time of colonization, when the British people came here and started documenting and actually setting boundaries of where these peoples resided and hunted, that was the first time that Indigenous populations ever had a real sense of sovereignty. And it wasn't a consequence of their own doing, it was a consequence of the fact that the British population had pen and paper to write on. By pen, I obviously mean quill. There is a strange dichotomy here where the British population, when they came here with their technology, and with all of the advancements they had made over the preceding 2,000 years, in so doing created their own demise as a consequence of the fact that they documented what they saw. There are plenty of people who pretend as though the British people who came here were somehow this militant force. There are approximately 200 militants on the First Fleet. The rest were convicts, and the rest is 1,400 people. It would have taken approximately 18 months to get back to England and come back again with the boats. These people were stranded here on an island that they did not map, they had no understanding of, and with a people who, by every single account, were in fact barbaric. And barbaric not in the moral sense, not in the fact that they did not have a human soul and a human identity, but in that they were so afraid of the people who they had never encountered before in their lives that their first thought was spear, not speak. Let's finish off. The last part of this entire show basically goes through the Indigenous youth crime rates. And all I'm going to do is just show what they show. We're going to end the show with that. That will be the finish of the show. We get to watch that video, and then I want you on your own to go and look up Indigenous crime statistics. Go look up why these children are in jail. Go look up what they're doing. Go look up exactly what it is that these kids are in jail for. It's COBA. Okay? It's juvenile justice. Juvenile justice, and I understand this quite well because I went to school directly next to a juvenile justice centre. Juvenile justice is not the same justice centre that you see. We'd watch the kids. They were constantly outdoors playing sports. 2 to 3 times a week, there'd be a truck that came in to bring them KFC. This isn't your, live in jail where you're constantly in solitary confinement. Yes, there's such thing as a spit hood. But that spit hood is utilised because kids keep spitting. These kids are in jail because they keep committing crimes. And not small crimes, mind you. I'll let you look up the statistics. And the pandemic that it is made out to be. Approximately 400 Indigenous youth across the country are currently in juvenile detention. Approximately 400. This is not some sort of pandemic. This is not something that is beyond the pale. This is not some racist plot to bring back the stolen generation. But this is the way that the ABC has chosen to frame the fight for Australia Day, the argument for Australia Day. to finalise it with this point, that White Australia and the White Australia policy is somehow taking over again, and that the Indigenous population of Australia deserves to change the date simply as a consequence of the fact that their ancestors have grievances and that they are not doing as well in their own minds as the average Australian. We've done everything we can do from what I can see. Every dollar that is spent seems to be making things worse. Every single statistic is getting worse. Look at the consequence of what they've done down in Victoria. Almost every metric is worse. The more that we give in to this grievance politics and pretending as though sitting back and pretending like what happened in the past affects today, that you have a right to claim sovereignty on a land that you never had sovereignty over, that you somehow have a claim to this land that is greater than any other person who lives here today, that your system of governance was better than what exists today, then you will never succeed. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to succeed. All you want to do is cry and whinge and destroy what is good about this nation. The prosperity, the safety, the opportunity. Patriotism that will be displayed on the 26th. You can keep claiming that we need to change the date, but it's not going to happen. Australia Day is set, and it's set for a reason. No single person was killed on the 26th of January, 1788. No genocide was committed, at least not intentionally. And there is no going back from the patriotism that built this nation into what it is, a place where Indigenous populations in Australia are now 120% larger than they ever have been in human history. Finish off with this clip. And this one really stings me, because I put this up on episode 1 or 2, this specific song, and I said that this is the greatest display of Australia that I've ever seen. A truly socially cohesive advertisement made by Qantas, and they decimated it with all of these false numbers, with this song that is made to make you feel bad for something that the Indigenous community has sole responsibility over. This has been the Mark Pirotta Show. God bless. And watch.
Into prisons like Banksia Hill. From Cobham to Cleveland, dumped like landfill. I'm only 10 and so far from ground. I shouldn't call this place home. Imagine it's your kids or your family when they lower the age of responsibility. And royal commissions just say what we know. No child should call this place home. Someday you'll act so shocked by all this, pretending like it doesn't exist. Whatever the problems that make us exist, the answer cannot look like this. Taking the kids like they took them before. They'll find my body on the cold jail floor. I realize something I've always known. No child should call this. Why do I call this? No one should call this place home.